Welcome to the Stanfords Travel Podcast. Mapping your travels since 1853, Stanfords is the world-famous independent map and travel bookshop based in London's Covent Garden. Thank you for joining us on this little podcast adventure.
Well, without further ado, please welcome, in conversation with Anne Morgan, it's Ash Bhardwaj and Phoebe Smith.
It's wonderful to be here at the Stanfords Travel Writing Festival. My name's Anne Morgan, and I'm delighted to be joined by two wonderful authors to discuss the question of really what we're all doing here, why we travel. And joining me to unpick that a bit and to see how we can make travel a bit more fulfilling is Phoebe Smith, who is the presenter of the Wonder Woman podcast, in fact, and also a Wonder Woman, author of 10 books, the most recent of which is Wayfarer, Love, Loss and Life on Britain's Ancient Paths. And next to her is Ash Bhardwaj, who has written the book that really should answer our questions completely, because it's called Why We Travel, A Journey into Human Motivation. And that's Ash's debut book, but he's also an award-winning journalist, broadcaster and speaker. And his book draws on his experiences travelling in various guises as a ski instructor with the British Army Reserve, and various as a travel journalist as well, and various other guises. So it'll be fascinating to get into some of that. So to start off with, I was wondering if you could both give us a bit of the background to your books. Phoebe, Wayfarer is a book built around pilgrimage, isn't it? Can you tell us how you came to be writing about that?
Yeah, so the book basically started with an event where I was sent as a travel writer on assignment to go and walk the Camino de Santiago in Spain, so arguably the most famous pilgrim path in Western Europe. And I'm not remotely religious. I remember being in school and going from a biology class where we learnt about evolution to then going into RE, and I asked how evolution fitted in with Adam and Eve, and was threatened with detention because Reverend Baker was like, I didn't come from any ape, did you? And I was like, yes, that's what Miss Jones has just told us. So not remotely religious. I was sent there to interview pilgrims, work out and find out, a bit like this, why people go on pilgrim routes, why they travel to these places to do it. And along the course of doing this, the last sort of 130 kilometres I did, you have to do 100 kilometres of the Camino to get your Compostela, which absolves you from a lifetime of sins. So even for non-religious, that's a pretty good deal.
Worth having.
Side note, they used to hire proxy pilgrims. A job was a professional pilgrim. Rich people would hire to go and do this for them and get them the lifetime absolution of sins. But anyway, by the time I reached the end, in the Cathedral of Santiago, and watched the Botafumeiro, which is this huge incenser, swing through the air at about 35, 40 miles an hour, looking around me, seeing these pilgrims who had reached this epiphany, this moment of, I've kind of find out my reason for being, I know what I'm doing. I looked around and I felt so incredibly lost. And I found it ironic that the path that most people walk to find their way, I'd got lost. And when I got back, over the period of the 12 months that followed, I quit my job. I was editor of the travel magazine, whose big stand you see here. I'd been doing that for 7 years. I quit that. That was my dream job. I broke up with my long-term partner, and I basically decided to start again. And through the process of healing and dealing with unresolved trauma of losing my mum very young, of my dad moving on very quickly, of having quite toxic and abusive relationships, I discovered the Pilgrim Network of Paths within the UK, which a lot of people don't realise that it's actually still illegal to walk a pilgrim path in Britain, because, of course, Henry VIII banned them because he wanted to divorce his current wife so he could remarry. And in doing that, what I firmly believe is he denied us all not the ability to go and do it in a religious way, but if you think about the origins of pilgrim, like anyone could be a pilgrim. So from the very poorest person to the richest person, it was perfectly okay and encouraged and understandable to stop everything and go on this long walk and reassess things and come back refreshed and intermingle with other people and talk to them. And I was invited on a British Pilgrim Trust pilgrim trail called the Old Way, which is based on the Goth map, one of the oldest maps they have record of, and it basically showed an old route, and the British Pilgrim Trust, which is a charity, were trying to re-establish it, and I went with them and very soon realised I had a lot in common with the other pilgrims around me, and that set me on a journey for looking for and finding more pilgrimages about Britain to try and work through things. And I never, when you write a book, you normally think, I'm going to do this thing so I can write a book about it. This is where this book really differs for me. The things I did were things I never expected to even tell people about, never mind put them in a book so people could read about them. But the process was so powerful and such a life-changing thing for me that when I sat down to write it, I couldn't help but put all of myself into it. And what started off as what my publishers believed they were getting was a beautiful book about pilgrim trails in Britain actually became part travel log, part memoir, part, self-help, all these things I never thought it would be. And to me, that kind of encapsulates and ties in nicely with Ash's book about the very different strands of feelings and situations that lead us to travel in the first place, whether it's overseas or in the UK.
Yeah, it's a beautifully personal book that I think it surprised me in so many ways. As you say, it brings in so many things. And there's a lovely acronym that you mentioned from the British Pilgrim Trust, BYOB, which has been repurposed, hasn't it?
Yeah, so they do BYOB pilgrimages, which is bring your own beliefs. I'm sure you can bring your bottle as well if you want to, and I'm sure people do. But yeah, the whole thing is, it's non-denominational, it's every religion, it's no religion. Anyone can go. Like I said, they're a charity, and that's how I started finding some of the routes. And some of the routes I found just by mistake when I happened to be in a part of England or Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. And there's just something very powerful about walking these walks with a purpose and knowing that our ancestors walked them, trying to find meaning too. Take religion out of it, there's something very comforting about walking through a holloway which has been formed by, thousands of years of footfall and feeling like you're not alone, you're part of a much bigger thing.
Yeah, we're going to get into this. It's really fascinating. Ash, can you tell us, why we travel? It's such an ambitious question to answer. You decided to structure the book around 12 different sort of motivations, among them being hope, curiosity, mentorship. Can you tell us about how that book came into being and why you decided to arrange it that way?
Well, like Phoebe's book, my book came about at a sort of inflection point in my life, and that was 2022. So, as it was for everybody, the pandemic was a bad time for travel journalists, but obviously it significantly affected our career. And then my mum went into hospice, and then my daughter Lyra was born. And obviously all three of these things, a pandemic, my mum being really unwell, and having a baby, are going to significantly affect your ability to travel. So I realised I was going to be travelling less frequently, and I was going to be travelling for shorter periods of time. So my times of travelling as a soldier or long distance expeditions were going to have to take a bit of a backseat. And so I thought to myself, if I'm going to travel less frequently and for shorter periods of time, how do I make sure that the travel that I do is fulfilling and that it's a good use of my time? And this was a question that my mates would ask me, so I'm sure you get this. As a travel journalist, everyone always says, where should I go on holiday? What should I do? Because there's three things that we have that are really limited: our time, our money, and our health. And so when you go on those holidays, you want to make the most of them. And so I asked all of my mates who were travel journalists or soldiers or artists, why do you guys travel? And what do you do when you travel? And read loads of books, loads of poetry, loads of psychology, psychiatry, philosophy, just got all these different things and lots of history and obviously lots of travel books too, and pulled out all these different strands. And then I thought, what were the most fulfilling journeys that I'd done? One was going to Ibiza to go raving, pretty fulfilling when you're in your early 20s. Helping deter the Russian invasion of Estonia with the British Army in 2018, pretty fulfilling. Not a lot of fun, lots of crawling through mud, lots of being shouted at by intimidating colour sergeants. And the other one was walking 1,000 kilometres of the River Nile with my mate Leveson Wood. Again, often not fun. So what was the common theme? What I realised was it wasn't anything to do with the mechanism, where I went or what I did. It was the fact that my reason for going on these journeys matched what I did on these journeys. And that was where the notion of these different motivations came from. And realizing that fulfilling travel is not where you go or what you do, it's what's right for you at that time. Because if I'd have wanted to go for a sense of service and purpose to Ibiza, that would not have aligned. If I wanted to go to do 2 weeks of military exercise in the swamps of Estonia, but my motivation was fun, again, I would have been sorely disappointed. So it was about figuring all these things out. And I figured out that there were 12 of them. I figured some of them out through the expeditions that I'd done, or the work that I'd done.
I mean, something I really enjoyed about your book was you don't make people feel bad for simply travelling for pleasure. You say that is a valid motivation, eudaimonic travel, as you say, as opposed to, what's the other version I'm trying to remember?
Hedonistic,
eudaimonic and hedonistic travel, yeah. You say that those are two both equally valid motivations, and it's okay, because part of me thought, reading your book, am I going to feel chastised if I decide to go on an all-inclusive trip to somewhere very comfortable? And but you don't do that.
No, if what you need is psychological healing and you want to have a bit of hedonism, going on an all-inclusive holiday can be the best thing for you. But if you have a sense of curiosity and you want to learn about the culture of a place, spending all your time in a resort isn't going to achieve that. Which is why it's important to ask yourself, what is my motivation at this time? Because sometimes I like hedonism. Sometimes I like hardship that gives me a sense of positive outcome and self-development. But it's understanding what you need at the time. Related to that, and I'm sure you've both encountered this, is this narrative of, are you a tourist or are you a traveller? I mean, we're all tourists, right? Unless you're going somewhere and doing something for the first time, you're a tourist, really. And the thing that makes a difference is what's your motivation, and then what level of dependency you have. So full dependency is you're going to stay in a resort. Zero dependency is you're going to live somewhere or going on an expedition. But that's a mechanism, that's not the motivation.
The funny thing about that is that reminds me of when you go on pilgrim trails, there's very much, are you a pilgrim or are you a walker? There's that same hierarchy of which one. And interestingly enough, the first holiday was actually someone doing a pilgrimage. The first travel guide was a book written by Egeria.
By a woman, wasn't it?
By a woman in the 4th century.
Yeah.
And she was going on a pilgrimage. So the why and wherefore of pilgrimage and travel very much intersect. And the kind of this system of looking down on one or the other, of I identify as this and not that, it really does intersect with both, I'd say.
Although there is a difference with pilgrimage versus holiday, I think, in that if you're going on a pilgrimage, you're going on an intention. I think the intention makes a difference. You can have an accidental epiphany, but when I've set out on a pilgrim type journey, there's been a level of intention, which is different to when I've gone for a bimble.
But I would argue that you could go on a walk and not realise that you'd somehow set that intention, and that's when you become, as I think I did, a bit of an accidental pilgrim.
Right.
I just suddenly realise I'm on a journey I didn't know I was on.
Going on holiday to relax could be an intention, couldn't it, arguably?
Yeah, absolutely.
You were saying, because in your book you do discuss pilgrimage, because you went to India to do tapana for your father.
Yeah.
And you asked your friend, you were a little uncomfortable with this idea of pilgrimage, your friend Leon, you said, what does pilgrimage mean? And he defined it as journeys of meaning toward a particular destination. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience and how that sat with you? Yeah,
and as Phoebe mentioned, the origins of tourism is pilgrimage, right? Going somewhere for a specific reason, around the UK or to the Holy Land for cleansing of your sins or a religious experience. The thing that Leon was talking about as a notion of a destination can be both a metaphysical one and a physical one. And when I took Dad's ashes to India, it was this thing that I have to do because I'm half Indian, my father was Hindu, but I didn't get on very well with him. So it was this journey that I had to go and do to kind of keep my Indian family happy. And it was a religious ritual, therefore I kind of had these trappings of pilgrimage. But I hadn't thought of it as a pilgrimage before I'd gone there because I didn't feel religious. And it was through speaking to Leon that I recognised that there was this intention of sort of psychological healing, but engaging with my heritage at the same time. And I did have a sense of epiphany at the end of it. I kind of resolved a lot of the trauma with my father, and then I also gained some insight into my heritage. And there's a second thing related to your point about it being the origins of tourism, is that the stories of pilgrims inspire others to maybe go and see other things. And the notion of inspiration as one of the motivations in the book is that you hear about places from other people, and that's what leads other people to go there. That can move it away from a notion of pilgrimage to then a notion of holiday or hedonism.
Well, so even Egeria, so her motivation was, I want to go and see the sites in the Bible. I want to go see the real places. So she went to go and find them, and then she wrote a book, which originally was published, I'm translating from the Latin, which was Travels of Egeria. Now, a few centuries later, the name got changed to Peregrinos, so the pilgrimage of Egeria. So it's just this interesting dynamic of what.
What year was that? What year?
Oh, I can't remember the year they changed it, but it was quite a while later. It's suddenly the name changed.
So when did she go and do these?
4th century.
4th century?
Yeah. So she was one of the early, and that's proper travel, isn't it? I've read about this thing, and I want to go see them in real life.
So I think
explorer.
Yeah. So I bring about this idea. It's like an academic concept of the notion of an explorer, a traveller, and a tourist.
Yep.
So the explorer is the first from their society to go somewhere and gain new knowledge, and then they come back and tell people. And that inspires the next people who hear that story and go, I'll go there and try and find, I know that place now exists, I'm going to go and learn more about it. And then the tourist, in this academic concept, is the person that tries to replicate what the traveller has done. Usually with an additional, it's more comfortable, which is why I say really we're all tourists, because, we're going on holidays. We're not really doing what Lev does, where he goes and walks on places that no one's done as a tourist before.
Yeah. I mean, there are other roles that personages can play, aren't they? You both refer in your books to walks or trips built around particular people. So St Hilda's Way was one that you followed.
Yeah.
There weren't many female pilgrim routes, but that was one that you found. And then you, Ash, at one point, one of the lovely things about your book is you give really great practical tips for what someone might do if they're wanting to achieve a certain thing with their travel. And you offer as an idea building a trip around a person that you're interested in. So you talk about going to see all the sites mentioned in Shakespeare's plays in London. And I just, that was interesting, how these roles, these figures attached to places. John Bunyan is another that in Bedford was significant for you. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that...
Yeah, so from doing the old way with the British Pilgrim Trust, I still hadn't really accepted that I was actually becoming a pilgrim or was a pilgrim. I still was kind of a bit in denial. That wasn't me, I wasn't religious. And so I found a route called the John Bunyan Way, which basically, he wrote Pilgrim's Progress, which there's a stat somewhere, which my publishers wouldn't let me put in because they were like, I'm not 100% sure it's true, but apparently his book has been reprinted and published into more languages than the Bible. Okay,
Really?
Pilgrim's Progress is
Wow.
what most people study in school, or at least used to. And so I wanted to go and see, and that was a case of the route basically takes you around where he lived, where he got imprisoned for preaching when it was against the law, where within his book when he talks about, the desolation area, you can see the actual landscape where he's referring to. And there's even like an old tumble-down palace which he referred to at Vanity Fair. That's an expression that comes from Bunyan. So it's very much, it was me feeling like I was being a pilgrimage but for something tangible, so an actual person. And the thing is, as a woman, funnily enough, I've never been interested in history, which sounds surprising because there's a lot of history wove into this book. And that's because I think growing up in school, I was either taught that as a woman, you were like a wife of Henry VIII and you got beheaded or pregnant or whatever. And then in the war, the men went off and you had to stay at home. And I didn't feel like there was a place in there for me. But then I didn't really ever take stock of my own history, the trauma that had taken place with me. And as I started to get involved in pilgrimage and try and really, to find a pilgrimage trail, you have to go back in time in history. And I started to realise that these different figures, St Hilda was actually linked to the saint and the Isle of Iona. And then he was actually linked to the guy, St Peter, who went down to Essex and did St Peter's on the Wall. And I started to realise how the whole history of the UK and how we are today was connected. And by studying the history and finding women like St. Hilda, a very strong female figure, one of the few women saints and one of the few female saints who have a pilgrimage named after her, I started to reconnect with the history of my country. And at the same time, I started to reconnect with my own personal history and reconnect my dots. And I think that's what pilgrimage did for me. It allowed me to go back and revisit something. It gave me time, it gave me space, and it was something I obviously so desperately needed without ever planning to do this thing.
Yeah.
And, I wouldn't go on a walk because, I definitely want to follow in the footsteps of St. Hilda. What attracted me to the St. Hilda's Way was that I'd been through a very traumatic incident with an ex who treated me very, very badly. And I felt like I started to look at my relationships with men and my lack of female role models, having lost my mum young, and I wanted a strong woman to follow. And, Hilda was that. For those who don't know, she was basically the abbess of where Whitby Abbey is now. She would have, if you ever see her in a church, she stood with a staff with an ammonite on the top, because the ammonite, there is actually the scientific name for the Hildaceras. So we see a religion and natural history merging. Back in the height of pilgrimage, artisans would pick up ammonites, because it's known as the fossil coast up there, and carve faces into the top to make them look like snakes. She is said to have rid the world of snakes. She has this strong energy and this natural history. The birds that fly over the abbey are said to nod their wings, dip their wings in acknowledgement of Hilda. She raised Caedmon, who was one of the most early poets that there was. She got him from nothing to something. She managed to help arguments happen. And when you go to Whitby Abbey, there's a statue that not many people notice at the top of the stairs of Hilda stood on the shoulders of men, of male religious figures. And that's a very rare thing to see. You go into a church, it's all men. It's maybe Mary, and she's, whereas this is this strong woman with this staff, this kind of, and so I think it was more the stories of these people, and realizing they were real people, and they did do these wonderful things, and just, like I said, that whole connection of being part of something bigger.
Yeah. I mean, that actually connects beautifully, Ash, to something that really struck me about your book, is the importance of engagement with stories and people and real life people. Like on your travels, you talk a lot about interactions you have with everyday people that you meet. There's a particularly funny story about Arsenal shirts that you discover in Africa, which maybe you can talk about. But it makes a beautiful point about exchange and curiosity, but a curiosity that is about meeting people on an equal plane and being ready to be changed or challenged by them, rather than studying them as some sort of interesting anthropological experiment or something that you're getting something from.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, the easy way to think about it is that whenever you go somewhere, you've been inspired by a story, or someone's told you about it, or you've seen it on telly, or you read a book. So you've got a reason to go somewhere. But it's not just an entertainment for you. It's not just a place to consume for you to have a good time and go home with good stories. It's somebody's home. Whether it's India or New Zealand or these awesome places that we like to travel, people live there. And so you have to take that thought with you when you go into a place. So that's the first thing. It's a place and it's a home. And then the second thing is it just makes it so much more enjoyable and interesting when you speak to people. And the story you're talking about, so Leveson Wood, TV explorer, walks long distances, suffers. Great. I walked with him, suffering long distances. And, we didn't have anything to do for most of the day. We're walking 50 kilometres for 8-9 hours a day. We'd chat to each other, but we ran out of conversation after a couple of weeks. And so we're just looking around and spotting things. And it's when you don't fill your itinerary with stuff that the magic happens, the serendipity. If you overplan, I've got a 2-week holiday, I've got to do all this stuff, then you end up just sightseeing and it feels like work. You're dashing from place to place. You're not experiencing it. But when you're walking, you just see stuff. And I noticed in village after village, town after town, that nearly all of the football shirts, about 70%, were Arsenal. Really odd, because in 2014, Arsenal were rubbish. And Man United won the league, City had won the league. I'm not a massive football fan. But I just thought this was really weird. Why would you support a team that's quite crap? So I started asking them and photographing, and everyone who's got a football shirt loves being photographed in their football shirt. So loads of young men, and it was all men, were like, yeah, coming out of the villages, and these were remote villages, literally huts, coming out, getting their photo taken. And then I was able to chat to them. Why do you support Arsenal? And it's because in 2001, when Arsenal went international, 13 years before Lev and I were there, they were a good team, they won the league, and they had loads of black players in their team. So these young black men in Uganda saw people like them in that team, they're like, that's my team. And they were winning. And then that loyalty stayed. But it was only because I was able to notice that and then had the confidence to ask them a question. And then I could ask them, what's it like living in this part of Uganda? And they'd be like, well, it's quite tough because we're a different ethnicity from the people in power. So nobody sends us any resources, there's no roads, there's no permanent electricity. This was the region where Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army was like raiding villages and stealing kids. So they're telling us about what that was like. And then the challenges of poaching because they had to get food. And they're next to a national park, which is full of, basically the freezer section of Tesco going past you every day. So I learned about their life because I'd noticed that they were Arsenal fans. And I mean, football's such a cliche as a starting point for a conversation, but I don't know anything about football apart from the fact that Arsenal aren't very good.
Yeah, it's amazing the connections it builds up. And I was struck, in both your books, serendipity is something you make a lot of. You say an empty diary is full of serendipitous potential. And you give a number of examples of how, having to take a detour, and both of you, I think there are instances in your books where having to take a detour yields something wonderful, or there's a chance connection. The wonderful festival that you attend on that walk in Sudan, I think.
Yeah.
That by chance having to take a detour that forces you. And things, I mean, sometimes, Phoebe, you break the rules a bit. You go off the route that you're supposed to be following, and you sort of sneak into Iona at one point, don't you? Or when you're not supposed to be there. But taking that slight chance, or deviating a little bit. I was thinking, a lot of the people in this room and a lot of the stands here are looking at trips where things are quite organised, quite sort of, there's an itinerary. How might a traveller doing that sort of trip leave room for serendipity? Do you have any tips how they might do that?
I would just ask if you can have time in places. So when you, as I said, you've got this limited holiday, you want to make the most of your money, make the most out of your time. So you go somewhere with this packed itinerary. And obviously, one of the things that differentiates one tour company from another are the things that they set up for you. And that, it's easy to say, I've had a good holiday because I've done loads and loads of things. But actually, when you think about it, when I think back on all the travel that I've done, both, the work as a soldier, all those other bits, or the work on press trips as a travel journalist, I don't remember the tick box sites that I saw. I don't remember what I ate in a Michelin star restaurant. I remember the down at Hill cafe that somebody recommended that I go and have lunch in. I remember the unexpected conversation with that guy in a Sudanese truck stop who sent me to a festival. So the first thing to do is remind yourself that those are the things that you're going to actually love and remember, and tell your mates back home. Because, we want to tell people back home good stories, but they also really fulfill us. So it's having, the recommendation I'd say is have the confidence in yourself to have nothing in your diary for periods of time, and just back yourself to make magic happen when you're there.
I'd also say use your tour guide. I mean, a lot of the times the tour guide can be your way into these places, and I've certainly been on organised trips where I've then spoke to the tour guide and said, I'd really love to meet a woman who does this, or I've noticed there's a lady every day who comes and sells this. Will you come with me? If I can't speak the language, will you come with me so I can try and have a conversation with her? Or, try and just look beyond the itinerary. Do the itinerary things, but see if there's extra things that you can do. Or if you're taken to a village to go and meet people, ask to be introduced and to try and make your own stories. And a lot of these tour operators are good. They do factor in, we're actually going to have an afternoon here then. And I think the temptation is to just veg out and do nothing and enjoy maybe the pool at the nice hotel that it tends to be on that night. But there's a lot to be said for then leaving the compound, leaving the group as well. I think we can all be guilty of the group mentality. Where's the group going for dinner, even though they've said go wherever you want tonight? Try not to. Like, some of the most insight I've had into places, I remember going to the Falkland Islands on an expedition ship, but we had a whole day there. And I refused to go on any of the guided excursions, and instead I went for a wander, and I went to the pub, right? Don't judge me, BYOB, remember. Went to the pub, and I sat at the bar, and I got talking to the barman, and then locals came in, and I got talking to locals, and one of them offered to, do you want to come and go? I'm going to show you this shipwreck that I know about. And so I took the chance and did that, and then I asked him what life was like. It turned out he'd moved over there 6 months. He was telling me what the adjustment of life was like from Britain to the Falklands. I learned more by doing that than everyone who came back with stories. It was all, we went to this and we saw this, and we went to this and saw this. But no one had any sort of insight in the place. So I'd agree with you there that it's that, we're all very guilty of it. We're all like quite shy and introverted, no matter what mask we put on out there. It's just pushing yourself to be open in every way. And I think for me, that's why pilgrimage was so important. I think I'd got myself into a habit of being very secretive about me and only writing about the world. And actually, the best interaction happens when you're very open about yourself as well, your faults as well as the amazing things you've done. And I think that was the change for me. I'd loved wilderness travel, going to really off the beaten track places, often on my own. And pilgrimage brought me back to people, and not just my ancestors who were there in some kind of spirit who'd walked these trails, but if you go and do a pilgrim walk, and even there's day walks you can go and do, look up the British Pilgrimage Trust website, they're free to download. You can look by location, distance. You go do one, and if you see another walker or another person, and you say hello, and rather just say hello, if you tell them you're on this pilgrimage, there's something that happens. There's a look in their eye. There's some kind of almost nostalgic, I don't know whether it's a genetic recognition, but people become more open with you and you become more open with them. And it's an incredibly powerful thing of just allowing yourself to do it. And as you said with the serendipity, that's really what the best pilgrimage is. It's like you can plan to do a pilgrimage, but you don't have to plan every part of it. And it's those chance interactions, that walker you might encounter, that person you might meet in a coffee shop and you tell them what you're doing and they tell you about something else. It's all those things that are the experience rather than actually the experience itself.
Yeah, no, it's fun. Yeah, it's a really, really great point. We're going to go to audience questions in a moment, but just before we do, I wanted to ask you both, do you have a big trip planned next? Where are you off to next? What's the next thing? Ash, where are you heading next?
I've had a couple of really good ones recently, but the one that I've just done was a return to Japan. So Japan, it was the trip to Japan that helped me understand wonder, which is this cognitive mindset that you can take to a place that allows you to experience awe. And I got that in this place called Hokkaido in the North Island. And then I realized if you bring that mindset home, you can appreciate home a lot more. It's one of the benefits of travel. You rehearse the approach to life that makes you experience awe. I grew up in Windsor. People come from across the world to come and see now His Majesty King Charles's castle, but it was Queen Elizabeth's when I was a kid. And I just used to walk past it and be like, nah, what's that? And so, having gone away and then come back and seeing it through a visitor's eyes, I really enjoy travelling around the UK so much more. I love it, but I did just do the Kumano Kodo, which is the only other UNESCO World Heritage Trail other than the Camino de Santiago. Yeah, they're twins.
So if you do both, you become a dual pilgrim.
Have you a dual pilgrim?
I am, yeah. They allow you to bang the drum at the Shinto shrine. I can see you nodding along. And you feel quite special because you're not normally allowed to this bit, and one of the monks takes you up and lets you hit the drum. It was a massive, it's a massive thing for me to do it, because then I did it with my then 3-year-old, which I was in a very different space.
Wow.
And I think for me, I have a big trip coming up to West Africa. I'm going in search of the origins of voodoo. So I'm very excited about that, because I love the way that religions and spirituality, even without believing in them, how it seems to bring cultures together and form stories again. So that's one I've got coming up in March. But actually, what I would mention that was a really powerful trip for me was that I went back and did the Camino last year. So the first time I did it was in 2016, did the Camino Frances, so the most famous of all the routes, the last 130k of that. But I got a chance to go back and do the Camino Portuguese, which was It was like night and day for so many reasons. I don't know, by show of hands, who's done the Camino de Santiago? Okay, and who's done the Camino Francis? And who's done the Camino Portuguese? This lady's done them all, she should be up here. But the Camino Portuguese is very different. A lot of solo women, I have to say. I would have called it almost like the Senorita Trail. I did the spiritual variant off the path. When I ended, the Botafumeiro wasn't flying because some screws fell down in a service about 9 months ago and they're scared to swing it. So they're doing all these kind of engineering look into it. But I went with a friend. I was in a very different emotional state, much more grounded, much more knew what I was doing there. Did it with a friend who it was the first time doing it, and she got very emotional at the end. And then I paid to meet with a local and do a tour of it and actually learn a little bit more now. I was in a better headspace. And what I learned, which I found was quite profound, is that there's the square at the end where everyone gathers when they finish the Camino. It's the mile zero. And everyone gets emotional there, hugs each other. It's a wonderful place to go watch, even if you've not done the Camino. There's a real, like in Love Actually, where he talks about the gates at Heathrow Airport. It's like that, like people
but
rejoin. Much better. Like that, lots of people rejoining, there's reunions. And the woman basically enlightened me. So the Portico Gloria, which is where people finish, she was like, this is where everyone thinks it ends. But actually, back in the day, the pilgrims would arrive and go into the square on the opposite side of the cathedral. They'd go in that door, do the pilgrim mass, and then come out. They would open the Portico Gloria. In front of them, the town hall and everything that's there wasn't there. You could just look out into the Galician hills, and it would normally be at sunset. And that was a big moment because that marked not the end of something, but the beginning of something. And I thought, isn't it really wonderful that all these people finish here thinking they've reached the end of something, when in fact, this is all just a new beginning.
It's lovely, yeah. So, does anyone have any questions for Phoebe or Ash, or both of them? We have a roving mic. Here we are, gentleman over here.
Hi, thank you very much. It's really, really interesting. I'm really interested. I've started to go, and you've touched upon it just now, Phoebe. I've started to go back to places. We all like to go to new places, and some people like to tick off countries, but I just wonder what you feel, from your experience, the value has been of going back, not necessarily to exactly the same places, but the same country, the same area, and exploring it differently.
I think it's and I'll pass to Ash as well, because I know I've spoken a bit, but I think it's hugely important, and I think that is the beauty of exploring the UK even, finding a spot. I was interviewing Ray Mears yesterday on stage, and he was talking about woodland and how much he loves woodland. And he's like, I'm not going to give you a list of woodlands where you should go. Go to the one nearest you and keep going back and notice the seasons, notice the change, notice the rhythms of it. And that's what makes the difference. And when I was younger, I was exactly not going back, been there, tick, done. And now, as I'm older, I think that's what changes. I think you want to go back and start feeling a place more.
Yeah, completely. The example I'm going to use is Paris, right? Which is not what you sort of think like an explorer expedition-y travel journalist would recommend. But the reason is, the first time you go to Paris, you go up to the Sacré-Cœur, you go to Montmartre, you go and look at the Eiffel Tower, and you go, brilliant, I've seen everything that I could have seen on the telly. And then the second time you go, I don't have to do any of that. I can go and do all the things I really want to do.
You're released.
You release from your obligations. And then you can bimble around like the back of the 18th and go and find like a random jazz bar. I went there with, I bumped into Hannah Meltzer, who's like the Paris correspondent for loads of newspapers. And she's like, come to this cafe. And we sat down and had a beer with somebody who called himself the mayor of Montmartre. Definitely not the actual mayor, but it was a very entertaining time. So 100%, go back to places. And New Zealand is very close to my heart. It's where the book finishes and starts. And first time I was on a rugby tour, so I didn't get to see much. And the last time I took my mum's ashes and scattered them there. And so it's a very different experience. And the other good thing about going back a second time is you feel slightly familiar. You may go in and pop in to see someone that you met last time and go, oh yeah, I came here a few years ago and I had this really amazing experience, and then they'll feel more open to you. You've got a reason to speak to people. So 100% go back to places, even Paris.
You can have a degree more intentionality, can't you? Because you have a sense of sort of what you were saying about the Camino. How you knew what you were doing there, you said. And it's that you can have that sharper sense of what I'm looking for here. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other questions? Oh, there's one over here.
Suddenly 2 hands went up.
Yes.
Hi. I'm assuming that as journalists you travel an awful lot on your own rather than with different people, and I'm exactly the opposite. I can't think of anything worse than travelling on my own. Wanted to ask you about what types of trips you do with what types of people, and I tend to do completely different trips with my father-in-law as with my wife, for example.
Well, you talk about that in your book, Ash, don't you? Because you travel mostly alone, and then you have to learn to travel with a partner.
Yeah. So this is a good question. I like it. There's a guy called Dan Kieran wrote a book called The Idle Traveller, and he references this idea of when you travel alone, the reason why people say that they find themselves when they travel is because you explore often neglected parts of yourself. This is the advantage of travelling alone. Because when you're at home, you speak to the same people every day, you go to the same places, you get into a certain pattern. When you're taken somewhere else, you're forced to speak to different people and do things that you wouldn't normally do. And you might decide, turns out I'm really good at dealing with like an emergency road traffic accident. I don't know, a really weird example. But you're really good in like difficult situations. Or you just decide, it turns out I really don't like spicy food. So you discover what's good about yourself or what you dislike, and that's important. Traveling with someone else, there's this notion called eroticism, and it's not sex tourism. It's the gap between self and other that allows for surprise and excitement. And when you travel, you get that with yourself. That's why you explore the often neglected parts of yourself. If you travel with your partner, then what you often end up doing is compromising on what your choices are to the point of both of you being frustrated. I hope this doesn't happen too much. I would recommend you plan one day, and then your wife plans the next day, or your father-in-law plans one day, and then you plan the next day. That way you both get to do everything you want to do for one day, and then the next day, you're forced to do what the other person wants. Now, you might find out that you like some things. You might find out you hate them, but you will discover something, and it gets you out of the rut of just compromising for each other.
I would like to jump on that and just say, so on my podcast, there's an episode called Are We Nearly There Yet? And that was from this summer when I took my 75-year-old dad and my 3-year-old and my partner on a train trip to go from Singapore to Bangkok. And that was a real eye-opener for me. Like, it made me, on the one hand, really miss the solo adventures I have, but on the other, seeing it through the eyes of a child and someone who's older who never thought they'd get to see these places was absolutely massive. And yeah, there was a lot of compromise. It's like, okay, this stop is clearly for my son, a water park. I actually had a really good time. I would never go to a water park, but we had a great time. Then for my dad, he wanted to go somewhere where there was a city. He'd never seen a Hindu temple. So I took him to that in Kuala Lumpur, and he was crying, and being able to have that moment with him. So I really am a great believer, and I'm sure, I know you say this in your book, that you've got to have one to appreciate the other. You've got to have the solo trips to appreciate the times when you're with loved ones. And then sometimes you can do a solo trip to really appreciate, you can be with people and say, I really like the time on my own. And then sometimes you can do a solo trip, but go as a group, like of strangers, and meet other people that have really similar interests. So I think there's a time and space for all of it. And you just pick your timing and your people. And,
in a way, that's where pilgrimage has a great advantage, isn't it? Because it's a group of strangers often going in the same direction. So you can have company, but you can also have your own. You have a real mix, and
there is definitely that's dynamic there.
And the Camino is like sort of not notorious. What's the opposite of notorious? Positive notorious.
Famous.
Famous, good, well known for that, right?
You make friends, and you, like I said, that square in front of the Portico Gloria is that reunion. That you can be doing it a week, and I guarantee you will finish, and you will know people that you'll see, or you'll go to a bar to have some tapas afterwards, and they'll come and say, "How did you find this bit? What about this?"
Yeah.
It just happens.
I hate to cut you off, but we are basically out of time. It's so sad, but I have the wonderful news that Phoebe and Ash will both be signing books after this. So if you have burning questions, you'd like to continue the conversation, I'm sure you'll be able to talk to them personally then. I'm very inspired to do some pilgrimage and to go and engage and discover things off the beaten track in a way that I might not have thought about doing before. So thank you both so much, and please join me in thanking Phoebe Smith and Ash Bhardwaj.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Stanfords Travel Podcast. You can find us at stanfords.co.uk and follow us on social media at Stanfords Travel.